All right, so a couple housekeeping things before we get going here. We are starting module 7 today, so that module reading was due before class started. Module 8's reading will be due before we start class on Friday, so we'll cover module 7 today and tomorrow, and then module 8 we will start on Friday. I've got the practice exam up for for exam number 2. It's also under the files tab, but you can find it kind of here on the home page. And then that module 5-6 quiz, as well as the participation quizzes from the last 2 days, will all be due at the end of the day Sunday, giving you a little bit of flexibility here. We'll publish this one right now. We'll go look at this participation quiz later on in today's class. Other than that, I don't think I have anything else to mention before we hop into material. Are there any questions before we get started here? One thing I did want to mention. That participation quiz, so there's still a decent number of people who haven't done that yet from Monday. That's the one that requires that lockdown browser. Please try to get on and get that done as soon as possible, because that's what we're going to be using for next week's exam on Friday. Okay. All right. So we talked the last 2 days about consumer producer surplus, maximizing surplus for the market when it's in equilibrium, and then how government actions can kind of change that, right? How it causes deadweight loss. So today we're going to think about not what maximizes the total surplus in the market, but what is going to maximize total surplus for all of society. So we're going to have this new term, which is an externality. So an externality is going to be an additional cost or benefit to somebody other than a producer or consumer of that good. Okay. So we'll run through some examples, but basically, we talked about before, the demand curve told us the consumer's marginal benefits. The supply curve told us the producer's marginal costs. And so that was just the marginal cost and marginal benefits to the people in that market. Markets can have additional benefits or costs to people that aren't even in that market. So they're not a consumer or producer of that good. So a couple examples, we'll start with positive externalities. So more specifically, a positive production externality. So this would be something that when it's produced, it will produce an additional benefit to people who aren't even involved in that market. So I don't know, if you're like walking by a bakery, even if you don't stop and buy something from that bakery, right? When you're not the producer of fresh, baked bread, walking past that bakery, you get an additional benefit because you smell this fresh baked bread. Right? It's kind of a cheesy example. A better one I always think is like beekeepers. Even if I don't like honey, I don't consume honey at all, I don't produce it, I'm not a beekeeper. The production of honey, these bees pollinate nearby fruit, orchards. So if I'm the owner of these orchards, I'm not involved in the honey or beekeeping. I'm not a beekeeper. I'm not involved in the honey market, but I'm getting some additional benefit. My crop yield is going up, or however the farm. I'm not in the agricultural world, but right, it would improve kind of how much fruit they can produce in their orchards, right? So there's an additional benefit to somebody outside of that honey market. Okay. Now, a negative production externality, I think this is the easiest one in terms of examples because we think about it a lot, would be pollution. All right, if I have these huge production facilities, making cars or whatever it is, a lot of smog is put out into the air. So these huge these huge production processes will produce a lot of byproducts that pollute the air and water. So even if I don't purchase a car, for example, like say I only use, a bike everywhere, I'm not a producer or a consumer of automobiles, but the production of automobiles is going to cause an additional cost to me, which is that the air and the water where I live might not be as clean. So, I don't know, another negative production externality, if you lived like in a city, maybe, if you live in an apartment above a bar or something like that, maybe you never go there, you're not a producer or consumer, but the additional noise, right? Noise pollution is causing you to have an additional cost, an external cost, or a negative production externality. We also have positive, negative consumption externalities. So a positive consumption externality, just to kind of give some examples before we dive into them here later on. would be an additional benefit to someone when something is consumed. So when you go out and purchase, or it's kind of weird to think about it this way, but when you buy a college degree, right, you're a consumer of education. People who don't go to college, they benefit from you having an increase in knowledge. You might be able, to provide them with products, like maybe you're going to end up being their accountant or finance manager, right? They're going to benefit from you improving your knowledge, even if they're not involved in the market for higher education at all. They're not a producer or a consumer, but the fact that you are a consumer is causing some additional benefit to other people in society. I also think vaccines may be a little bit, I don't know, these days maybe a hotter topic than it should be. But the science of it is, if you get vaccinated against something so that you cannot get the disease, so let's say I choose not to get vaccinated. The fact that everybody else is, I'm benefiting from that. If everybody else is getting vaccinated so they can't get that disease, I no longer can get it from them. I don't even have to be involved in that market for vaccines. I'm going to get an external benefit or a positive externality from the fact that other people are consuming those vaccines. Okay. And then negative consumption externality, pretty pertinent, kind of recent example. I did not buy any fireworks this year. I did not produce any fireworks. My neighbors consumed some fireworks, and so I have a 7-month-old. One of the reasons I didn't buy fireworks, right, is because when my neighbors were consuming fireworks, guess what? That imposed an additional cost to me, right? Because my child woke up. So noise is a common kind of external consumption cost. You can also think about, like, if someone's smoking, right, and you walk by them, like, it's, at least my personal preference is I don't like the smell of cigarette smoke. And so if someone else is consuming a cigarette, I'm not a producer or consumer of cigarettes, but I bear this additional cost, which is I have to walk through this smoke. Okay. So we've got external benefits and external costs, or positive and negative externalities, and it can come from the production or consumption of a good. So the first thing we'll look at is negative externalities, but we'll think about, okay, what if I just had a typical market, right? So usually our demand curve, it's telling us the marginal benefits to the consumers involved in that market. So I'll choose gasoline here as the example. So what I'll start calling this is demand represents the private marginal benefits, right? Or the private value to the buyers or consumers. Supply represents the private marginal costs, or the cost to the producers of that good. So when the market was in equilibrium, we said this is where total surplus in the market is maximized, or where the sum of producer and consumer surplus is maximized. Okay. Excuse me. In this example I have here, that's going to be at what, 25 gallons. Now, if, let's say I have an electric vehicle, right? I am not a consumer or producer of gasoline. I don't need it. But other people are using it, right? That's going to cause some pollution, which will impose an additional cost to me. Even though I'm not involved in the market for gasoline, I now have this additional cost from the pollution. Let's say we could somehow put the valuation at $1 per gallon. So our external costs and benefits, we're always going to think about them as like a per unit basis. So the negative externality, we can put a valuation per unit of it's causing a $1 negative externality. Okay? Or that's the value of the negative externality, or an additional cost. So if I have an additional cost, and we'll come back to the slides here in a second, but I think it'll help if I start to build out a graph for us to kind of use for later on as well. So if I've got a market, I've got my supply curve, and I've got my demand curve. Demand represents the marginal benefits to the consumers. Supply represents marginal cost to consumers, or marginal cost to producers. And we have our equilibrium quantity. Okay. If I have an additional cost, right, there's an additional cost to society from this pollution. What that's saying is that at every quantity, the marginal cost to society will be, well, whatever the marginal cost to producers was, plus whatever that negative externality valuation is. And that's going to be true at every single unit. Right? So when we model negative externalities, we say the marginal social cost is going to be higher than the private marginal costs. How much higher? The value of that negative externality, or whatever that external cost is. Okay. So if we don't have any additional benefits, no external benefits, the private marginal benefits will be the marginal social benefits. So if society is making the decision about where they want the quantity to be, society's total surplus will be maximized where the marginal cost is equal to the marginal benefit, but for society. So where would the marginal benefit be equal to the marginal cost for society? For something that has a negative externality, that would actually be at a lower quantity than what the market gets or kind of arrives at. Okay. So with negative externalities, the market will overproduce. Okay. So we're thinking about here in our example, right? We said we'll always model negative externalities as additional costs or kind of model that through the supply curve. It looks like a supply decrease, but supply hasn't changed. It's just that we're drawing in what like society's supply curve is or what society's marginal social costs are. Any questions there before we keep plugging away? Okay. So if we have our society's marginal costs now in here, we said, excuse me, the quantity that they would want to see in this market is where the marginal social cost is equal to the marginal social benefit, or just the demand curve now, because we don't have any, the marginal private marginal benefits are the social marginal benefits when we don't have a positive externality. So here we can see that society wants the quantity to be down here at 20. The market, we said, stopped at 25, or shouldn't say stop, but they arrived at 25. So society wants that quantity to be a little bit lower. Also notice that for society, for any quantity below 20, what is true? The marginal social benefits are greater than the marginal social costs, right? So every unit here is still adding like positive net benefit to society. The net benefit is positive because to society, the benefits are still greater than the costs. That's true for every unit until we get to this point where they're equal. So we would say they're indifferent. However, if the quantity goes past that point of 20, society's costs are now greater than the benefits to society. So for every unit between 20 and 25, what is happening here? Well, for society, the costs are greater than the benefits. That's like a negative net benefit or negative surplus. So the overproduction of this good by the market is going to cause deadweight loss to society. Not deadweight loss to the producers and consumers of gasoline, but a deadweight loss to all of society. Okay. So this looks a little bit different than when we were looking at price controls, taxes from last couple classes. There, like the triangle was kind of on the left side. Now it's going to be over here on the right. Okay. But the reason why it's there is because it's the loss of surplus to society, or when the difference between the costs and the benefits are actually a negative value, right? The costs are greater than the benefits. Okay. Let me think. So yeah, I'm kind of jumping the gun here, but how could we convince this market to actually reduce the quantity? I'll kind of give you a depiction later on, but we can impose a tax, shift that supply curve, right? I'll focus on that more later on, but kind of just alluding to some things that we'll talk about here in a little bit. That would be one solution. Okay. Now, I've got some animations set to show you this, but I think I can also do kind of draw it out. I think we'll kind of help to first see it drawn out. Let's say I had a market that was in equilibrium, right? So well, here's one way of thinking about it. If we were at that socially efficient quantity, what is the total surplus to society? So total surplus to society would be like at every quantity, starting at 1, add up the difference between marginal social benefits and the marginal social costs. So where would that be on our graph? That would be kind of like this triangle here. Okay. Now the market, where is the market's surplus? Well, here was our equilibrium price. If we allow the market to decide where that quantity and price is going to be, where supply is equal to demand. So we would have consumer surplus here, area above price below the demand curve. Producer surplus would be the area below the price, but above that supply curve. So it looks like, well, the market, there's more surplus there than what I was just telling you for society. The reason why is because we no longer just have producers and consumers. When we're thinking about the total surplus to society, we now have to add in, well, what is the total cost of this negative externality? Well, at every unit, we have this additional external cost times the number of units that we see in this market. That represents like another type of surplus. It's just here, it's going to be a cost, so it's negative surplus to society. So this is going to look like, oh, it would be like if I was finding the area of a rectangle. Close. Visually here, it's going to be the area of a parallelogram, right? So what would represent the total cost to society if we allowed the market to get out to this quantity? Well, at every unit, here's the additional costs. So this parallelogram would represent the total cost to society. So if we wanted to know the total surplus, this would be producer plus consumer surplus, but also, and here I guess technically, whatever that total cost to society is, right? We kind of add that cost in there. So you'll notice this additional cost to society, it kind of like cancels out the producer and consumer surplus in this range. So that's like a wash. So we have this surplus, but now we have this additional cost over here because the markets went to this higher quantity. This triangle is what we said was representing deadweight loss. Right? So if we allow the market to operate, get to that higher quantity, yeah, we have this producer and consumer surplus. It's negated by this additional cost to society. And in fact, the additional cost to society, there will be part of that where there's no surplus to kind of offset it. This would be our deadweight loss. Right? So another way of, I've got a lot of colors going on here, but we can kind of think about this using animations here in the slides, and I think I can kind of give you a slightly different depiction that'll hopefully solidify this idea. So I've got my negative externality drawn in here. I said, really, what is total social surplus? Where would it be maximized? At this quantity where the marginal social cost is equal to that marginal social benefit. Right? If we allow the market to get out to this price, we said we had consumer surplus, triangle on top, or the area above price but below the demand curve. Producer surplus, the area below price but above the supply curve. This additional cost to society, we said for every unit, there was this external cost. So take the external cost, multiply that by the quantity the market arrives at, and this parallelogram would represent the total additional cost to society. So we said we can kind of see here, this area is going to cancel each other out. There's some additional surplus to consumers and producers, but there's an additional cost to society. What area is there nothing to kind of cancel out? It's going to be this little triangle here. That would represent our deadweight loss. Or another way of thinking about that deadweight loss, why is that deadweight loss? Because before, if we were at the socially efficient quantity, here was total surplus. If we get to that market quantity, well, this essentially goes away. So we're left with this total surplus area still. However, we now have this area where the costs are greater than the benefits. This would be negative surplus or a loss of surplus, which is our definition of deadweight loss. Okay. Any questions before we keep moving here? Okay. So with a negative externality, and this is kind of intuitive, if there's negative externalities like pollution, well, then the market's not taking into consideration those costs. They're always going to be overproducing those goods. They don't have to worry about cleaning up the pollution. They're going to produce more than what's optimal for society. Okay. Whoop. Any other questions there before we keep moving? Okay. So what about positive externalities? Okay. So with a positive externality, we can think about this is going to be something where either the production or consumption leads to an external benefit, right? So we've got the private marginal benefits to consumers or buyers. We also have this additional benefit to people outside the market. So the way that we're going to model positive externalities is if it's additional benefits, well, what represents benefits? The demand curve. We're going to model it through the demand curve. Okay? So if we're looking at the socially optimal quantity, right? Any quantity below that, we should have units that the benefits exceeding their cost. Any quantity above, now the cost is above the benefit, or sorry, now the cost is greater than the benefit. That would actually be like a negative net benefit, right? So we'll kind of think about that here. I'll draw this out for us with positive externalities and kind of give you a little bit of a taste before we look at the slides. So I've got price, quantity, got my supply curve, which reflects marginal cost, private marginal costs. Demand curve reflects private marginal benefits. The market will arrive at this quantity and this price. If there is a positive externality, well, then we would think about at every single quantity, the marginal benefit to society is whatever the marginal benefit is to consumers plus some additional amount. Right? So at every quantity, we would be adding in whatever that external benefit is. This would be society's marginal benefit or the marginal social benefits. Now, without any negative externalities, the marginal cost would simply be our marginal social costs. So where would society want this equilibrium to be, or where would total surplus be maximized for society? Where marginal social benefits are equal to marginal social costs. So when you have a positive externality, people in the market are making decisions without taking that into consideration. They're actually going to end up at a quantity that is too low. Okay. And then here, what's true if the market stops here? Every unit in between that market equilibrium and where society wants that equilibrium quantity to be, what's true about the marginal social benefit relative to the marginal social cost? Well, now that marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal social cost. So all of these units will be providing net benefits that are positive to society, but the market stops here, so we're missing out on all of this surplus. So if we're missing out on this surplus, that would be a loss of surplus or our deadweight loss. Okay. So with negative and positive externalities, that deadweight loss is created in either one, but it comes from like two different avenues. With negative externalities, it comes from the fact that we're overproducing and that there's some units in the market where the costs are exceeding the benefits to society. With positive externalities, that deadweight loss is coming from the fact that we are underproducing and that there are some units where the marginal social benefit is still above the marginal social cost, but the market is not producing those goods. Okay. All right. So putting some numbers to this and kind of just seeing it in a slightly different context. If I was looking at this graph, what would be the external benefit from every unit? So I can see here that the social benefits are greater than the private marginal benefits. How much greater? Well, if I look at any quantity and I look at what that difference is, that difference should be the value of the external benefit, the kind of per unit value of this positive externality. So here it's like what, 50 to 70. So I should have an external benefit of $20. Or I could look at the intercepts, 100 minus 80. That external benefit is $20. Okay. So kind of like negative externalities, the difference between our private marginal benefits and the difference between our private marginal benefits and society's marginal benefits is the external benefit. Just like with negative externalities, our external cost was the difference between the private marginal cost and society's marginal costs. Okay. And then I kind of already discussed this, but where does that deadweight loss come from? And I stole this, I shouldn't say I stole this, but I had this from kind of an old textbook that I had. But I like the depiction. It's very clean. It just shows, if the market stops here, there's a certain number of units where that marginal social benefit is still above the marginal social cost. So that's going to be where our deadweight loss is coming from. I kind of drew this out for us here. Okay. So just like we had with negative externalities, we'll try to give you a depiction of where this deadweight loss is coming from. So I'll first do this one in the slides, and then I'll kind of draw it out for you. So let's say I had this positive externality. What is total social surplus? Well, it's going to be at every quantity the difference between the marginal social benefits and the marginal social costs. So it would be this entire black triangle. If I think about, well, where is producer and consumer surplus? Well, when the market stops at this quantity and arrives at this equilibrium price and quantity, here's consumer surplus, here's producer surplus. Right? What is the external benefit, not just the per unit, but what is the total benefit to society? Well, once again, just like with the total cost to society, it'll be whatever the value of the external benefit is on every single unit times the number of units sold in the market. So here, the value of the external, like the total external benefit or the total benefit to society, is going to be this parallelogram up to whatever that quantity the market stops at is. Okay. So this is total surplus for the market, or sorry, total surplus for society if we allow the market to make the decision will be consumer plus producer surplus plus now this additional social benefit. But notice, if we were at that socially efficient quantity, all of this would be total social surplus. It's actually a little bit larger. What area are we missing out on? Oh yeah, all these units that are not being produced on the market that actually still had positive net benefit or positive surplus to society. Okay, so that's why kind of that area that we're missing out on, that represented our deadweight loss. Okay. Another way of thinking about this, and it once again gets a little bit tricky just with the overlap of colors, but I think seeing it drawn out also might help with some questions that people might have when we're thinking about this. So I'm going to draw this pretty quick, but we've got supply, demand, we've got our marginal social benefit with a positive externality. We said if there is no negative externality, the supply curve would represent our marginal social costs. Okay. So we think about here, that was the equilibrium price that the market gets to. Okay. So where would consumer and producer surplus be? So here's consumer surplus, right? Here would be producer surplus. And we said this area up here represented total surplus to society. Okay. Let's say that we, instead of stopping at this socially efficient, or the equilibrium point for the market, we force the market to the efficient quantity for society, right? Well, if that would be the case, notice at this price, what is true about the price relative to the demand curve or the marginal benefit to consumers? Well, the price is actually above the consumer's marginal benefit. This would be like negative consumer surplus. And then the price here is below producer's marginal costs. So this would be like negative producer surplus. However, if the market were out at this higher quantity, what is the additional benefit to society? It would be this parallelogram, right? So notice this gain washes out that negative producer and consumer surplus. And what we're left with is this additional positive benefit to society, which is why out here at the efficient point quantity for society, we actually have a gain of surplus, right? There will be a loss to producers and consumers, but that will be washed out by part of the gain to society. And then there will be this additional gain to society that isn't washed out by any negative surplus. So if we forced it out to this quantity, producers and consumers are actually going to be worse off, but all of society would actually be better off. Okay. All right. Any questions over anything there before we keep moving? Okay. So kind of got, well, I alluded to this in a previous slide, but we've got positive and negative externalities. How can we force markets out to that socially efficient quantity? Okay. Well, in an ideal world, we would use taxes for negative externalities. And in this ideal world, we would have an exact evaluation of the per unit cost of that negative externality, and we would set a tax exactly equal to that. Subsidy, same kind of idea. If we could put a per dollar valuation, or sorry, a per unit dollar valuation on our positive externality, we would want a subsidy that's exactly equal to that. So let's kind of think about why. So when we had a negative externality, we said, so if I think about this as the marginal costs, marginal benefits, here was where our initial equilibrium would be in the market. We said with a negative externality, that's an additional cost. So society's costs are up here. Society wants that equilibrium quantity and price to be here. So like the socially efficient price and the socially efficient quantity would be where the marginal social cost is equal to, but with no positive externalities, the marginal social benefit is the same as our private marginal benefits. So that would be here. How can I push this supply curve so that it exactly matches up with society's costs? Well, what's the difference between the supply curve and my marginal social costs? The value of that external cost. So if I had my marginal social cost, I can rewrite that as the private marginal cost plus the external cost. Okay. So how can I get my supply curve to be exactly the same as that? Well, my supply curve represents the private marginal cost. If I had a tax that was exactly equal to that external cost, now my supply curve matches up with society's costs. So when I have a negative externality, how can I push that equilibrium quantity and price to the socially efficient point? I could use a tax. Okay. Now, what are some other tools we talked about that we could use with a negative externality? Well, if I want the quantity to be lower, what could I do? Just set a quota, right? Not allow there to be any more than a certain number of units in the market. So that's one way, right? Taxes, quotas, or if this is the socially efficient price and I don't want the price to be down here, what else could I use? If I don't allow the price to go any further below, or to go any lower than this point, I could also use a price floor. And then it's not maybe as clear, but what also limited quantity, I could also use an effective price ceiling. Okay. All right. So price floors, price ceilings, quotas, taxes could all help solve this negative externality issue, right? Eliminate that deadweight loss that existed to society. Okay. Same kind of thing, but for positive externalities. If I have a positive externality, got my supply curve, got my demand curve. If I don't have a negative externality, the private marginal costs are the same as society's marginal costs, right? But with a positive externality, we said we always model positive externalities as additional benefits. So we model it kind of through the demand curve. So the market stopped at this quantity and arrived at this equilibrium price. Society, their marginal social benefits, right, we said at every quantity, the benefit to society will be whatever the benefit to the consumer was, plus some additional amount. So society wants the quantity, kind of, we can almost think about like what the efficient price would be for society to be up here. How can I encourage the market to increase quantity? Well, if my marginal social benefit is just the private marginal benefits plus this external benefit, how can I get my demand curve to be exactly equal to that? Well, my demand curve reflects marginal benefits, so I could add in a subsidy that was the exact same value as that external benefit that would increase that demand curve until we hit that socially efficient quantity and price. So with taxes, we have quite a few more tools to use than we do with subsidies. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? So I think there was like three. I'll leave this up here because I think you want to go back to the slides. You can see the little video. So, what are the ideal tax and subsidies exactly equal to those external costs and benefits? Now, to be fully, complete in our discussion of this, I could also, if we didn't have a market-based economy and it was more command and control, well, I could just put a limit on the amount of pollution, or I could like put a quota, right? Just cap something. Now I could also, if I had a command and control economy, I could just tell, right? If I was like a dictator, I could just tell these companies to produce more if I had a positive externality with something. But more generally, most of the markets that we're thinking about are not dictated by one individual, or we don't have like the government coming stepping in and telling you exactly how much to produce. So a lot of the times we'll see the government use market-based policies, imposing taxes or subsidies. There's something that I don't think we'll get to today. We might try to touch on if we have time, just because it's kind of applicable to the real world, which is tradable pollution permits. So even if there's a way in which you can limit the quantity with allowing companies to pay for the right to pollute or for the right to do something that causes a negative externality. If we have time next class, I'll kind of go through this. There won't be any questions on the quiz or the exam on it, but it is kind of an interesting thing if we do have time. But yeah, for the most part, we see governments use taxes and subsidies to kind of push the quantity in these markets to be where we think the socially efficient point is. So electric vehicles, right? It's kind of weird, but we think of electric vehicle, really it's removing costs of pollution. So there is an additional benefit to society. So if there's an additional benefit, positive externality, we want more of them. So what does the government do? Subsidizes electric vehicles. Okay. All right. And in doing this, subsidizing or taxing goods, what we kind of call this is we're forcing the producers and consumers in the market to internalize what those additional costs and benefits are, right? So in our example where there was an additional cost to gasoline of $1, right? That was like the valuation of the negative externality of pollution. We would want to have the producers internalize that additional cost. So we add a cost to them, which is a tax, right? And then now they start making decisions with this additional cost in mind, or basically using society's marginal cost to make their decisions. Then the decision that they're making should lead to what the socially efficient kind of decision would be for society. Okay. And just to be clear, we could actually, it's a little bit more difficult, and I always will model the use of taxes to solve negative externalities through producers. You can model it through consumers and get the exact same results. So we went through, was it yesterday or the day before? I showed you how a tax on consumers or producers will have the same result. So it doesn't matter who you tax or subsidize. When I tax either party, I get less of the good. When I subsidize either party, producers or consumers, I would get more of the good. Okay. So internalizing those externalities is the way that we solve these market failures, right? With positive, negative externalities. And then I already drew out your kind of corrective tax, subsidy, and quota example. So if there's no other questions on that, we'll kind of move to the next topic. And in fact, before we move to this next topic, we won't do this at the end of class today. Let's go ahead and take a look at this participation quiz. Okay. So we'll kind of round out our discussion on positive and negative externalities. I'll point out a few things that maybe I didn't earlier. So let's say I gave you a graph that looks something like this. It doesn't have anything labeled, but if I have a downward sloping curve, I know that should represent demand. So this green line is going to be demand or the private marginal benefits. I know one of my upward sloping curves is going to be supply or the private marginal costs. Now, I said we always model negative externalities through that supply curve because they're additional cost to society. So if it's an additional cost, that means society's marginal cost must be higher. So this gray line should be our marginal social cost, and then this blue line would be our private marginal cost or the supply curve. So where will the market arrive at? Well, where does supply equal demand? That would be at that quantity of 60. Where does society want that quantity to be? Well, the efficient quantity for society will be where the marginal social cost is equal to the marginal social benefit. That would be down here at a quantity of 50. So the market arrives at a quantity that's too high. If I'm then, thinking about an even easier question, what's the value of the externality depicted above here? Well, we already said we know it's a negative externality because we have a higher social cost curve. To get the value of this externality, you just look for the difference between that supply curve and the marginal social cost. So we could look here, goes from 40 to 55, so that's 15. I could look here, it's going from 35 to 50, that's 15. I could also look at the intercept, 10 to 25. The difference between this marginal social cost and the private marginal cost should always be that same per unit external cost of $15. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? Okay. I then have the exact same graph, but now how would we calculate dead weight loss? Okay. So I think from what we've talked about, it might be easy. I shouldn't say easy, but we should know that where does the dead weight loss from a negative externality come from? It comes from the fact that the market is overproducing. So for every unit from 50 to 60 here, the marginal social cost is above the marginal social benefit. So there will be like negative surplus from every single one of those units or dead weight loss. Okay. So you would calculate the area of this triangle. So it's what, 15 times 10 times a half. So it should be what, 75. But there's another way we can think of this. Okay. And I'll do it for subsidies as well, even though that's not one of the questions in the quiz, kind of a shorter quiz here with just 2 questions, but maybe something I could ask you, or you could see on the quiz for the module or on the exam. So if I've got a market, here's our equilibrium, and this is the quantity that the market arrives at. If I have a negative externality, we said our social costs are higher than the private marginal costs. And the efficient point for society really should be down here. Okay? Well, if we wanted to calculate dead weight loss, we said for every unit in between the socially efficient quantity and the market equilibrium quantity, the marginal social costs are greater than the marginal social benefits. So there, like our surplus from those units would be to society negative, right? Benefits would be less than the costs. So this area represents our dead weight loss. We actually don't need to have anything on this y-axis. What will the height of that dead weight loss triangle always be? Well, what's the difference between society's costs and the private marginal costs? Just the value of the external cost. Right? So if I'm thinking about dead weight loss from a negative externality, the height of our triangle will always be the value of that external cost. What's the width of that triangle always going to be, or what's the base? will always be the difference between that equilibrium quantity and the socially efficient quantity. And then it's a triangle, right? We have linear supply and demand, so multiply by 1/2. Okay. So even without the grid lines, if I told you what the external cost was, and then you could identify what the socially efficient and market quantity, equilibrium quantity are, you could actually calculate deadweight loss. Okay. Now, if you have the grid lines, it makes it a little bit easier because you can, find this point and this point. And, oh yeah, the difference will always be my external cost. Okay. Now you could do a very similar thing, but for positive externalities as well. So what will deadweight loss always be for positive externalities? So if I've got my supply curve, demand curve, equilibrium quantity, marginal cost, marginal benefits. Well, with a positive externality, we said at every quantity, there's an additional benefit. So my marginal social benefit curve was up here. No negative externalities now, so we've got a marginal social cost here. Society wants that quantity to be actually higher. So for every unit here, the marginal social cost is less than the marginal social benefit. There would still be positive surplus that could be gained for society, but the market stops at this quantity. So notice, what is the height of that triangle always going to be? My external, I didn't leave myself a lot of room, but benefit. So when I'm thinking about deadweight loss from a positive externality, it's going to be the height of that triangle is always the external benefit. What's the width always going to be? How many units the market is underproducing by? And then it's a triangle where we have linear supply and demand. So we then multiply it by 1/2. Okay. So when we look at these things visually, like they're rectangles, parallelograms, and triangles, but really they represent different things. The height of this triangle is the value of the external benefit. The width of the triangle is the underproduction of that market. Okay. Any questions before we keep moving here? Okay. So that should do it. Just those 2 questions for the quiz. The next thing we'll talk about is the idea of Coase's theorem. So Coase's theorem says when we have these negative externalities or positive externalities that exist, one thing that could solve the issue of under or overproduction is if we allow people to bargain, right? So the idea is if we allow people to bargain, whoever values something more will always be the person that kind of dictates what happens in that market. So I've got a basic kind of toy example that we'll kind of work through. I might kind of give you another one to think about afterwards, but this is the old book, right? So Dick owns this dog named Spot. The negative externality is that the dog barks and the neighbor Jane hates it, right? So the socially efficient outcome will always be in this simple 2-person society where total surplus of the 2 individuals is maximized. Okay. So if we think about if Dick values having the dog more than Jane values her peace and quiet, the dog should stay. Whether or not Jane has the ultimate final decision or if Dick has the final decision. So we'll think about case 1. Let's say the owner of the dog, Dick, has the right to keep Spot. The benefit to Dick of owning the dog is $500. The cost to Jane, she puts a valuation of this barking at $800. Well, is there, if we allow them to kind of bargain back and forth, let's say Jane offers to pay Dick $600 to get rid of the dog. Well, if the benefit to owning the dog is $500, but if I get rid of it, my neighbor's going to give me $600, where am I better off? Taking the $600, Dick would decide to get rid of the dog. Is Jane okay paying that $600? Well, her cost to paying is $600, but if the dog stays, her cost is $800. So yeah, she's better off as well. And notice, what would the total benefit to this society be if the dog stays? Well, benefit of $500, cost of $800, negative $300. What's the gain if the dog goes? Right? my benefits go down by 500, my costs go down by 800, so a benefit of $300. So the total, the efficient point for society would be that the dog leaves, and if we allow these two individuals to bargain, even if Dick has the right to, say final decision if the dog stays or goes, we would see that the dog leaves, right? There's a range of values, any amount of money in between 500 and 800, both people would be okay accepting that in order to get rid of the dog. I kind of hate this example because, if you're a dog lover, like that, there's no amount of money that would, that you would get rid of your dog. But this is just kind of the little setup that I have. Okay. Thinking about an obvious like negative externality, right? The dog barking. So here our private outcome would be the efficient outcome. What if Jane has the legal right? Well, this is kind of easy, right? If she has the right to decide whether or not the dog goes, she doesn't have to offer Dick any money. She just says, I want to get rid of this $800 cost. The dog has to go, right? And there's no amount of money that Dick could be willing to pay. He'd only be willing to pay up to $500 to keep the dog, right? So whether or not Jane has the legal right or if Dick has the legal right, if they can bargain back and forth, either scenario, we end up with the dog goes away and we're at that socially efficient outcome. Okay. Now let's think if these were a little bit different. So now we had a society where Dick values owning his dog at $1,000. Jane, $800 is the additional cost. Well, if Dick has the right to keep the dog, right, what's going to happen, right? Well, is there any amount of money Jane is willing to offer Dick to get rid of the dog that he would accept? Well, she would offer up to $800, right? That's what her current cost is. So any amount lower than that, she'd be okay with. However, if she offers $700, will Dick be willing to take that? Well, he values having the dog at $1,000. If he accepts that offer, he'd only have $700. He'd be worse off. So the dog is going to stay, right? And we can think about, is this the socially efficient outcome? Yes, because what was the total benefit to society here? Well, now the additional benefit is $1,000, cost is $800. The total benefit to society if the dog's staying would be $200. That's what should occur. And I don't think I put this slide in here, but let's think about this in a slightly different way. Right? So if, so here we had, really, if the cost to Jane was $800, she'd be willing to pay any amount less than $800 to get rid of the dog. However, what would I have to pay Dick to get rid of it, right? Something above the marginal benefit of owning the dog of $1,000. Notice there's no overlap here, right? So well, you might think of, okay, like if offered $900, would Dick be willing to get rid of the dog? No, she's not willing to pay $900. The most she's willing to pay is $800. The lowest amount Dick would be willing to accept is $1,000. So there's no scenario here where bargaining would result in the dog leaving. It doesn't matter if Dick or Jane has the right. Now, if we give Jane the right, she doesn't have to pay to, send the dog away. She has the decision. She would choose just to get rid of the dog. So what is Dick going to do? He's going to offer her $900. That $900 now becomes her marginal benefit. Is that marginal benefit greater than her marginal cost of $800? Yes. So she would be willing to let the dog stay for any amount of money in between $800 and $1,000. So, if Jane has the right or Dick has the right, we'll still see kind of the result being in this scenario that the dog stays. Okay. So that's kind of Coase's theorem. Here we'll think about it in a slightly different context. So let's say I had something, and this is kind of similar. Let's say we're trying to make an agreement and someone has, oh, I don't know. Let's say I'm living next to a neighbor and there's this tree and it's about to fall down, right? My neighbor doesn't care, right? So, well, let's not do it. That's a bad example. What do I want? I want something where there's like a negative. Oh, I don't know. Let's say, I don't know, someone wants to smoke a cigarette and they'd be willing to pay $5, or the benefit to them is $5, right? So you would have to pay them something other above $5 in order for them not to smoke, right? And then the cost to the other person might be, I don't know, $6. So I'd be willing to give them any amount less than 6 to have them stop. So there's a range of values that we could agree upon. If I give that person $5.50, they're better off than they were before. They won't smoke the cigarette in front of me. I'm okay paying $5.50 because if they did smoke it, the cost to me was kind of 6, right? Now, let's assume that we couldn't do this civilly and bargain back and forth, but we had to get a third party involved. And they said, in order for me to kind of arbitrate this, you're going to have to give me $1, right? Or actually, we'll say give them $2. Well, now there's no amount of money in this range. So let's say this person even would be indifferent at $5. But now if I have to, in order to kind of come up with this agreement, pay an additional 2, would this person be willing to pay $7? No, right? So this would be like if we have transaction costs, right? That previously where we might have seen Coase's theorem work, where there's a range of values where these two individuals could come to an agreement. Now, with this additional cost, it forces that total cost to be outside of the range. Kind of similar to that tax example I think I gave yesterday, or it might have even been on Monday. So transaction costs sometimes will cause Coase's theorem not to work out. Now, usually, what does this look like in practice? My little cigarette example, because I mentioned that earlier, of a negative externality. It's not like someone's going to charge me money to arbitrate that. But if I'm talking about like disputes between neighbors, right? And like, I was going to use the tree example of like getting rid of a tree that might in their yard that might fall on my house or something like that. Well, now we have to get lawyers involved. That's a huge transaction cost. Maybe now having to pay those lawyers, right? I don't think it's worth it to me to pay this lawyer this money. We don't come to any agreement. Stubbornness can also be something that kind of causes Coase's theorem not to work. And really, what that is going to be is if I'm trying to, those people that like they really value, they want to be right, or they want to get their way. Well, if all I care about, right, my valuation in my life is getting my way, what is the marginal benefit to getting what I want? So let's say my neighbor has that tree and it's about to fall on my house, right? If they don't want to get rid of that tree, they're stubborn, right? I go, okay, I'll give you $1,000. No, that's that margin, I'd be giving them 1,000. That's a big marginal benefit. What about 2,000? No. Well, I got up to 100,000. No. If you had to be right, what is your actual marginal benefit of getting your way? Infinite. There's no amount of money that could be offered to you where you would actually come to an agreement. Now, usually it's not infinite, right? But stubbornness can increase that amount of money that would have to be offered in order for that person to kind of come to an agreement. So transaction costs, stubbornness, and then something we won't really dive into in this class. But if you have anything more than like these simple 2-person agreements, like you've got hundreds of people involved, then you have to like come up with some type of, agreement. You have all these you have coordination problems, right? The more people you have, the harder it is to find kind of mutually beneficial solutions, right? Or evaluations that would work for every party involved. So this is something that would be, dive into in a higher level econ course. But just to kind of be complete in our discussion, these are some of the things that can cause Coase's theorem to break down, where even though we allow people to bargain, we might not see the private outcome end up being the socially efficient outcome. Okay. All right. So I have a kind of summary slide here of positive, negative externalities. Got some additional examples that we have in here. Noise pollution, I kind of mentioned that one, not from airports, but restoring historic buildings or like public, neighborhood parks or something like that. So we didn't really talk about cap and trade. This is the one thing I said I might do next class if we have time. What we talked about solutions to negative externalities primarily was these Pigovian taxes, but also quotas and then those 2 price controls, price ceilings and price floors. Positive externalities, really the only solution there we had was a subsidy. Okay. So we will start this discussion and then finish it tomorrow. But with this idea of negative and positive externalities, we are going to think about them in the context of different types of goods. So everything I've done up to this point has primarily been thinking about what we call private goods. So private goods are going to be things like a car. You buy your car, it's yours, right? You're the only person using it. We also have other types of goods. So one is going to be like a public good, right? So a public good is going to be something that you don't have to pay a price directly for. So I use like state parks, national defense. Yes, technically, like we pay for them through taxes, right? But once that good is out there, you don't have to pay a price to use it, right? You enjoy the benefit of national defense without having to directly pay for it. You benefit having like I think is it Bryant Park here in Bloomington. You can just go use that park, right? Once it's out there, once that good is out there, anybody can use it. It's free. So generally, you think of like public goods are going to be goods that are free to use once they're kind of produced and then they're out there. Right? Clean water and air would be another example, right? And once it's out there, you get to enjoy the benefits of it. So the allocation is not necessarily going to be dictated by market forces if a good doesn't have a price, right? And when we're looking at all these markets, we have quantities and prices. So we're going to end up with, for public goods, quite often not at the socially efficient quantities. Even if we don't have these problems of transaction costs, et cetera, with public goods, we're not going to end up at that socially efficient quantity. And we'll dive deeper into this next class. But just with the idea in mind, we have different types of goods, public versus private goods. Okay? So what makes a good a public good versus a private good, and we'll talk about two other categories as well, are going to be two main characteristics. Okay? So just to give a little bit of an insight before we jump into that discussion. So with public goods, I said we usually don't end up at the socially efficient quantity. So you can think about something like national defense, right? So what is so we would have like our marginal social cost, right, of national defense, which, same as our supply curve since we don't have negative externalities. What's the total marginal social benefit? And this could be, I don't know, number of tanks, airplanes, bombs, whatever, we're thinking about national defense in terms of the number of units. Well, the efficient point for society might be way out here, right? You don't want to be a society without any army, right? But if we allowed individual consumers to make the decision, if we didn't have a kind of government that collected taxes from people, what is the marginal benefit to any one person of a national defense? Well, it's great, right? I have my freedom, things like that. But like relative to the total benefit to society, every individual demand curve is going to be way lower, right? So if we were just allowing the market to make the decision, is there any one person who is willing to fund the entire military? No, right? Every individual demand curve, there'd be no point where demand and supply intersect. In fact, a lot of times with these public goods, the efficient point in the market, if we allowed individuals to make the decision, would actually be zero. But we know that for society, there's a huge amount of surplus to be had if we can get out to this socially efficient quantity. So with public goods, a lot of the times we think about there's like these huge positive externalities, and if we just allow individuals in the market to make the decision, we're not going to end up with the quantity that we want. So how do we identify what is a public good, what's a private good? So two main traits. The first would be excludable versus non-excludable. So excludable goods, these are going to be things that essentially you have to pay a price to use. So these are most goods that we would probably think about. So like if I go buy a Jimmy John's sandwich, I have to pay. I can't just go behind the counter and take it, right? Or if I want to use AT&T internet service, I have to pay for AT&T's internet, right? It's excludable. I can't use it unless I pay for it. Okay? A non-excludable good is going to be something I can use without having to pay for it, essentially. That's the easiest way to think about it. So once that good is out there, I can't prevent others from enjoying the marginal benefit that it gives. So this is like, once the national defense is paid for, I can't prevent people from enjoying the marginal benefit that it exists. Once a free public park is out there, I can't prevent people from going to use that public park, right? As long as it's a free public park. So non-excludable and excludable goods, right? This is going to be our first characteristic that defines the types of goods we're going to be looking at. The next thing, and I'll give more examples, and I think will kind of help once I get to those categories, but a rival versus a non-rival good. So a rival good is going to be something that once I buy it, nobody else can buy that same unit. Now, they might be able to buy the same type of good. So if I go to Jimmy John's, I can go buy a sandwich. I would say that it's rival because once I buy it and eat it, no one else can buy and eat that same sandwich. They can get the same type of sandwich, but not the one that I actually ate, right? Or maybe an easier way, like a stadium ticket. When I go and buy a ticket to row 4, seat 3, nobody else for that event can go buy a ticket to row 4, seat 3, or airline tickets, same kind of idea. So those would be idea of rival goods. Non-rival goods, and I probably should update, but like if you go to iTunes Music and you want to actually purchase music, well, you buying a song doesn't prevent everybody else from also buying that same song, right? Or think about like the internet service example. Yes, it's excludable, but once you use it, like once I pay for AT&T internet service, my neighbor can also buy AT&T internet service. I'm not preventing them from buying that exact same good. So their non-rival would be when one person uses it, it doesn't prevent other people from using it, or it doesn't decrease the quantity that's available to other people. Okay. Me enjoying the benefit of a national defense doesn't prevent other people from enjoying the benefit of national defense. Okay. So excludable and non-excludable, kind of think about that almost as like price and free. Rival, non-rival, me using it prevents other people from using that quantity or decreases the quantity available. Non-rival, me using it does not decrease the quantity available. Right? That's going to give us 4 different types of goods. So the first is going to be the most common one that we've really talked about all throughout this semester. We just haven't put a name to it, but these are private goods. So typically thinking about things like, I put personal computers here, but like cars, and think about clothing, right? Most of food, most of the goods that you buy every day are private goods. You have to pay a price to use them. They're excludable. So in order to buy this laptop computer, I've got to pay a price. Can't just go back and grab it at the store. It's rival in that once I buy that specific computer, it decreases the quantity available to other people, or no one else can have that exact same computer, right? It's mine now. Okay. Public goods are going to be the exact opposite. They'll be non-excludable and non-rival. So I like the idea of the lighthouse one better even than national defense. If I'm up on Lake Michigan and there's a lighthouse and it's on, right? Well, it's non-excludable. Anybody who wants to be out boating on Lake Michigan can use that lighthouse, right? They don't have to pay a price to use it. The light is out there. They're using the light. It's also non-rival in that every boat out on the lake can use it, right? Me using it doesn't decrease the amount of light available from the lighthouse that's available to other people. So that would be an example of a non-excludable, non-rival good. Those are going to be our public goods. Now, the other two are a little bit weird, and we'll talk quite a bit tomorrow about common resources. Not as much about natural monopolies in this class, although we will talk about natural monopolies in a subsequent module, right? So this will be after the next exam. So if I have an excludable non-rival good, this means I have to pay for it in order to use it. That's excludable. But it's non-rival in that me using it doesn't prevent other people from using it. So a really good example of this is like cable TV. I know this is kind of falling out now that we have like YouTube, things like that. So you can think about this really as like internet service, right? You have to pay to use it, but it doesn't prevent other people from also using that same internet service. Right? Electric, right, in an area. So a lot of the times these are natural monopolies. You might already be kind of familiar with the term monopoly being one. There's only one seller. So a lot of times regionally, there's only one electric company, or there's only one gas company, or there's only one internet service, right? So when you have these excludable non-rival goods, a lot of the times you'll see these natural monopolies arise, okay? And then the only other combination we have of these traits, rival and non-excludable, these are going to be common resources. So I use kind of fish in the ocean here. Non-excludable means that it's free, right? So if I want to go out and fish and catch fish in this lake, I can, right? No one can prevent me from going up to Lake Monroe and fishing. Although we have, maybe legal restrictions that can cause common resources to no longer be common resources. We'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. But let's assume it's a lake that's open to the public to go fish. Right? So I go up to Lake Monroe. I can catch, as many fish as I can go out and don't have to pay to catch fish there. Now it's rival in that once I catch a fish and keep it, nobody else can catch that same fish, or I've decreased the quantity available to other consumers. Okay? So that combination of traits, we would be looking at common resources. Okay. So next class, really today we were looking at positive, negative externalities in the context of like private goods. Tomorrow we'll talk about positive, negative externalities that exist in common resources and public goods. Okay. And then we'll talk about natural monopolies. Like I said, I think what's that going to be? Module 11, I believe. Okay. All right. So I think I'll save this example. We'll kind of start class with it just to revisit this idea of the different types of goods. I also have another example that I like a little bit more than this road. Although I like this example because it shows how the same good, a road, can be classified as different types of goods depending on different characteristics of that road. Okay? And then I think I also have one where I'll look at, think about office hours, like in a typical semester, how office hours can actually become different types of goods as well, if I were to like charge a price for them, right? So we'll talk about that starting out next class. We'll do public goods, common resources. That really should kind of round us out for module 7. I don't think there's anything else. We already went through the participation quiz today. So unless there's any questions before I end the recording here, I think that'll do it for us today. So remember, that module 8 reading will be due before we start class on Friday. It's currently up there on Canvas, and go through Top Hat. You've got today's participation quiz due at the end of the day Sunday. So all the participation quizzes from this week, as well as the module 5 and 6. And tomorrow I'll post the module 7 quiz. Once we complete module 7, those will be due at the end of the day on Sunday. Okay? All right. See you guys tomorrow.